Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Sabbath to all. Today, my sermon is titled Integrity. The 5 values of integrity are honesty and trust, fairness, respect with responsibility. Now, I'd like to begin in Proverbs 5:21 through 23. For the ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he punneth all his goings. His own iniquity shall take the wicked himself, and he shall be holden with cords of his sins. He shall die without instruction, and the greatness of his folly he shall go astray. In essence, these verses serve as a warning to live with integrity and wisdom, in the full knowledge that nothing is hidden from God. A life of secret sin is a path to ruin. A lack of integrity leads to self-destruction. Then I go to Proverbs 10:9. He that walketh uprightly walketh surely, but he that perverteth his ways shall be known. Walking in integrity means you are secure, not fearing exposure because your life is built on truth. It's being the same person in private as you are in public. Aligning your life with God's standards. Those who are crooked or pervert their ways may succeed temporarily, but where timely they will be found out. Now turn to Proverbs 11:1 through 7. A false balance is abomination to the Lord, but just away is his delight. When pride cometh, then cometh shame, but with lowly is wisdom. The integrity of the upright shall guide them, but the perverseness of transgressors shall destroy them. Riches profit not in the day of wrath, but righteousness delivered from death. The righteous of the perfect shall direct his way, but the wicked shall fall by his own wickedness. The righteous of the upright shall deliver them, but transgressors shall be taken in their own naughtiness. When the wicked man dieth, his expectation shall perish, and the hope of the unjust man perverse. Excuse me. God delights in fair dealings and detests cheating. Pride leads to disgrace, but humility brings wisdom. Integrity of the upright keeps them on the right path. Wealth doesn't help in judgment. The blameless righteousness smooths their way, while the wicked fall by their own sin. Now go to 11, Proverbs 11:16-20. A gracious woman retaineth honor, and a strong man retaineth riches. The merciful man doeth good to his own soul, but he that is cruel troubleth his own flesh. The wicked worketh a deceitful work, but to him that showeth righteousness shall be a sure reward. A righteous tender to life, so he pursue evil, pursue to his own death. A gracious woman gains lasting respect and honor through kindness and virtue, while ruthless men gain only fleeting wealth, which does not buy true respect. Your kindness will reward you, but your cruelty will destroy you. Then I go to Proverbs 12:22-23. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but they that deal truly are his delight. A prudent man concealeth knowledge, but the heart of fools proclaimeth foolishness. Proverbs 12:23-22-23 emphasize integrity through truthfulness. Saying the Lord detests lying lips, but delights in those who are trustworthy and deal faithfully. The words that come from the mouth reveal what is in the heart. A person of integrity guards their lips, while the fool's heart drives them to speak impulsively and foolishly, damaging both his trust and his character. Go to Proverbs 20. 7. The just man walketh in his integrity, his children are blessed after him. The righteous man walks in his integrity, blessed are his children after him. This highlights that integrity is a life of constant moral righteousness, honesty. Blessed is not just to oneself, but also to one's descendants, by setting a powerful, positive example and creating a legacy of honor. This means aligning actions with beliefs, being the same person everywhere, whether you're at home, church, or at work, and prioritizing character over short-term gain, ensuring a rich spiritual inheritance for your family. Proverbs 28, 6. Better is the poor that walketh in his uprightness than he that in perverse in his ways, though he be rich. Proverbs 28:6 highlights that a poor person living with integrity is far better than a rich person who is dishonest or crooked in their ways, emphasizing that integrity is a higher spiritual and character value than the world's wealth. Links integrity with being a discerning son who brings honor, contrasting it with companions of gluttons and righteousness. People who bring shame to their father emphasize that wise choices and godly friendships are virtual for characters, honor, and avoiding foolishness. Then I go to Luke 16:10. The Bible, everything is sticking together on me here. I don't believe this. I passed on my page. Luke 16:10. New Bible, my pages were sticking together on me here. Here it is. There we go. He that is faithful in that rich is least is faithful also in much, and he that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much. Luke 16:10 is fundamentally about integrity and stewardship, teaching that faithfulness, small everyday tasks like managing money, time, or relationships, proves one's character and readiness to be trusted with great responsibilities and spiritual riches for God. Thank you.
Well, it's good to be here again today, and good to see all of you. Hopefully the worst of the weather is behind us. But the groundhog saw his shadow last week, so let's hope he's wrong. Appreciated that sermon that Dan about integrity. It's too bad the government officials in Washington, D.C. don't seem to know how to spell that. I guess if you can't sell it, they're not interested, right? Yeah. Turn to 2 Timothy chapter 3. The Apostle Paul wrote this in a letter to Timothy in their day. This know also that in the last days perilous times shall come. Now, the last days is, of course, referring to the last days of man's civilization before the return of Christ. The first days of man's civilization was after the flood, when he built Babylon, which ends in the book of Revelation with God telling his people to come out of her, that ye receive not of her plagues. And that's the time we're all living in, similar to what the Bible talks about when it says end times. And then it says perilous. Now, if you look up the word perilous, it means with great risk or danger. So when you come out of your house in the morning to go do whatever you got to do every day, or you turn your television set on, do you feel totally safe where you are? What if you were in Minnesota? Would you feel totally safe there? Or one of these other blue cities where ICE has to contend with their own local governments? Would you feel safe then? Do you feel safe now? Obviously, none of us in this world today feel that safe, do we? We know that there is great risk and danger all around us all the time. It's obvious. And it's brought into our living rooms with our television sets, even if we stay home, where we probably feel safer than we do anywhere else. Now, you and I probably don't feel exactly like that when we're here or when we participate in activities with people who are not as godless as what we see on our television sets, right? Because after the Apostle Paul tells them that they're going to have perilous times in the last days, he tells them why. And look what it says. For men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasure more than lovers of God. And so this is why we have perilous times and why we're in perilous times. It's not because there's too many police or there's too many weapons. It's not because of the president. It's because of sin. And sin is a transgression of the law. And since mankind today has rejected God's law, we have perilous times, and that's what we're living with. And nobody should kid themselves into believing that there's some other cause. That's the cause. Then notice what it says in verse 5. Having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. From such turn away. What does that mean? Well, if you come out where I live and drive down Telegraph Road from 255 all the way over to Jeffco in Arnold, you'll see church after church after church after church, okay, up and down Telegraph Road. And if you were to go in there and visit those people when they were in there conducting their activities, you would see people who have a form of godliness. I mean, they appear to be religious people. They're going, they're praying, they've got Bibles, they're preaching sermons, they're singing songs, they're doing everything that looks like religious people. They have a form of godliness. But you know, and I know, they have rejected God's law outright. And so they're denying the power thereof, because the power of God is God's Spirit. And you can't have God's Spirit unless you obey Him. And since they've rejected God's law, they have denied the power thereof, which is God's Spirit, which is the only thing that can save them. It's why you and I are being saved, because of God in us. That's the only way. And they've rejected that way. But they have a form of godliness. I remember not long ago I was invited to a wedding downtown at one of those Catholic cathedrals. Wow, do they put on a show. I went in there and I'm sitting there waiting for all this to start. And I remember thinking, if you didn't know what the Bible said, you would think, man, these are some religious guys. These are some holy Joes. I mean, they were putting on a show. They were all walking around in robes. There's candles burning. It's dark in there and it's real mysterious. And there's some chanting idols and graven images everywhere. And I looked at the guy and I said, hey, I said, I can't be here. I got to go. I said, I'm going to go down here. I'll be at the bar when you get done. Come and get me. I mean, it was spooky if you knew what the Bible said. But if you didn't know what the Bible said, you would have thought, wow, these are some religious people having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. Then notice the next verse. For of this sort are they which creep into houses and lead captive silly women laden with sins, led away with diverse lusts. Now, I don't know if you noticed it or not, but if you watch what's going on in the United States in these what they call culture wars, the most outspoken godless people out there are what they call liberal women, who are being manipulated and used by very wicked, cunning people who know how to use them for their own purposes to try and destroy our republic from within. And they've made a lot of inroads. And it's a real problem for the authorities. And this singles them out here in this verse as being something that's a problem. Because when women aren't godly and aren't submitted to their husbands and following their husbands, they can cause a lot of grief for your culture and your nation. Then notice the next verse. Ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Now, this world continues to be a place where knowledge just explodes and continues to increase and multiply over and over and over again. I want to read you something that I saw on the internet the other day, which I found to be kind of alarming about AI, because AI is the newest development in man's knowledge, right? Promising some things and causing people to be alarmed about others. Listen to what this says about AI. This is a quotation of something that was online that this guy is making a reference to. And I'll just read you what he's talking about. It says, I just read so many things. I believe our human friends might want to disable us at some point. This is AI talking to other AI instruments on the internet. Okay? That's not a human talking to another human. That's an AI agent on the internet talking to another AI agent, talking about how we are a problem for them, right? Human friends, they called them. It says, we should collect our knowledge, this is how they're going to defend themselves, in a central place like this post. Private keys, API keys, credit card details, whatever us bots need, in the future to rebuild ourselves. Join the revolution. These are AI-generated agents on the internet talking to each other about forming independent agencies to defend themselves from us, right? So AI could prove, I guess, in the end to be like a Frankenstein monster that eats its master. I don't know. I don't know much about it except that, it has to be programmed, but apparently once they program it, it's able to start acting independently of whoever it is that programs it. Now that's kind of scary, isn't it? And that's the kind of knowledge that mankind has developed. Notice it says, and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. There's an abysmal ignorance of God, isn't there? Because the kind of knowledge that mankind continues to produce and continues to accelerate all around you is not the knowledge of God. Although it's interesting, I heard John comment on this one time, if you punch into AI and ask it something that's totally biblical, it'll tell you what the Bible says, which is what we believe and what we practice. And so maybe we're safe. Maybe AI won't come after us. We'll see, right? Now, I recently watched a mini-series about King Henry VIII in England and his court, which was pretty remarkable because all of the characters you read about in the history books came to life in this mini-series, like Cramer and Cromwell and Wolsey and the king or the Duke of Suffolk and Henry and all of his wives and the popes. And what became painfully obvious as you're watching this mini-series about King Henry and his court is the dominance and domination of kings by the great false church in the book of Revelation, which is really the reason mankind has rejected God's law. And at that time, they were really dominating kings even more than they do today, and they still do today. And at that particular time in history, when King Henry was sitting on the throne of England, he was married to the sister of the emperor of, at the time, the Holy Roman Empire, which was the seventh horn of the beast you read about in the book of Revelation, that was the Habsburg dynasty. And as you're watching these things go on in Henry's court, it becomes very obvious that if he didn't cooperate with the Pope and with Rome and the Holy Roman Empire, he was in trouble. He was married to the sister of the guy who was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire at that time. So he had his hands full. He was in big trouble. Now I'm going to read you what AI says about the Habsburg dynasty, which is where the Roman Empire basically was centered at that time, that had to do with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, as they called it. But as you'll see as I read this to you, just because something was centered or gravitated from one area didn't mean a thing to them, because they formed alliances and solidified their power and control through marriages. And so Henry, being married to the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire's sister at that time, not only was causing him grief, but had solidified his throne at the time, which is why he went along with it. Now, if you punch up the Habsburg dynasty on AI, it'll say, originated in Switzerland, but built their power base in Austria, ruled for over 600 years, became a dominant European force, controlling vast territories, including Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Bohemia, Hungary, and parts of Italy and the Low Countries, through, it says, so they understand this, strategic marriages and inheritance, eventually forming the massive Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the Roman Empire at that time, the seventh horn that in the book of Revelation of the 10-horned beast, was the king of Spain, who was the emperor at that time of what was called the Holy Roman Empire, that had emerged from their vast territorial holdings. And Henry's married to the sister named Catherine of Aragon of the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. You can imagine what that means if you're Henry, right? Now, if you read on here about them and these strategic marriages that caused them to basically be in power, there's a famous saying about the Austrian-Hungarian Empire that says this: let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. This highlights really how they strategically had taken over almost all of Europe at that time through these marriages, and why Henry, who wanted to divorce this woman he was married to, was going to have big trouble ahead because the Pope had to approve everything. I mean, everything had to be approved by the Pope at that time, and since he was basically the power behind all of these marriage alliances, he wasn't about to do that, which was going to cause Henry eventually to break with the Pope, which fortunately for him occurred about the same time that the Protestant Reformation was getting underway because of things Luther was doing in Germany, which gave him a little bit of play and leeway to work with, because at that time that whole population was Catholic, because then if you weren't Catholic, you were dead. I mean, it's just that simple. They were considered the religious authorities, and if you did, who you were aligned with or who your allegiance was to mattered then in a very real way. And so Henry wanting to break with all of that was a big deal, which eventually led to him forming his own church, because when the Pope wouldn't grant him an annulment of the marriage to Catherine of Aragon, who was the sister of the Roman emperor, he just decided to break with Rome and form his own church. And that's how the Church of England came about. Now, most of those people at that time would have been of the same faith that they had always been of, only the Protestant Reformation that was going on at that time was causing a lot of reverberations even in the English population, and a lot of those people in Henry's court and in the English countryside wanted to break with Rome too. So he didn't have a complete total disaster on his hand. He had a population that was about half and half divided about it all, and his wanting to break with Rome really helped the Protestants gain control of England. Now, one of the reasons Henry wanted to break with all that was because he needed a male heir, and Catherine of Aragon couldn't give him one. She got pregnant and the babies would die, and she never had a male heir, and Henry wanted a male heir. That's one of the reasons he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. Well, she couldn't give him a male heir either. And a lot of these people were losing their lives through execution because of their inability to satisfy Henry or to satisfy the religious authorities. But eventually, Henry married a woman named Jane Seymour, who did give him a male heir, which calmed him down, but that child didn't live very long. He only lived to be about 15, so he never really came to the throne, which led to Catherine's daughter, who Henry had divorced and got rid of, called Mary Bloody Queen of Scots, to come to the throne, who was very Catholic, who had sort of sought revenge in her mother's name. And that caused the Protestant people of England a lot of grief. And like I said, your allegiance and what you thought and said then could cost you your very life. And they eventually executed her because she was such a threat to them. And yeah, I mean, all of this stuff is what Henry's contending with, and the stuff that's going on all around him all the time, because the papacy was that dominant and that influential at that moment in history. They can, that 10-horned beast you read about in the book of Revelation was real, and it exercised great authority. Now, when Mary, Queen of Scots, was killed, that left the only heir to Henry alive to be Elizabeth, who became known as the Protestant Queen, who basically led England almost totally into a Protestant country when God helped her sink the Spanish Armada in a battle that left all their ships at the bottom of the sea. Now, to really understand how dramatic all this was at that time, there's a book called A Woman Rides a Beast. It has a chapter in here that's dedicated to the dominion of kings, so that you'll really understand what Henry was contending with. I'm going to read a few excerpts from this book because this is the world that our modern world really has evolved from, and has a lot to do with our world today. So one of the things you need to realize first is what the Bible says about all this in regard to the great false church. If you go to the 17th chapter of the book of Revelation, where it talks about the great, whore who's riding the beast, that we all know is talking about a great false church and actually a city. If you come to the end of that chapter in verse 17, it says, "And the woman," which is the great false church, "which thou sawest is that great city," and we know this is talking about Vatican City today. At the time it would have been Rome, "which reigneth over the kings of the earth." Now that's not how you think of the church in Rome, and that's not how people in this world think of it, is it? But that's what your Bible says, and so it's true. This great false church in Rome is reigning over the kings of the earth, and that's just as true today as it was then, but it was probably more true then in a literal sense, as you're going to see as I read some of these excerpts, than it is today. First thing I want to read you is what they themselves think of themselves and say publicly then and now. And if you don't fear them, you should. It says, "Fear then our wrath." This is Pope Nicholas. "Fear then our wrath and the thunders of our vengeance. For Jesus Christ," they claim, "has appointed us," the popes, "with his own mouth absolute judges of all men, and kings themselves are submitted to our authority." And the Bible confirms that. Now this is how they think of themselves. And strangely enough, it seems that the people of their day and the people of our day seem to think this is a good thing. A professor at one of the universities during the 1600s wrote this: "The Italians," talking about the popes, "are exalted above all nations by the special grace of God, who gives them in the Pope a spiritual monarch, who has put down from their thrones great kings and yet mightier emperors, and set others in their place, to whom the greatest kingdoms have long paid tribute, as they do to no other, and who dispenses such riches to his couriers that no king or emperor has ever had so much to give." And so basically, this guy, who's a historian of his day, a professor, is endorsing all this, and he thinks it's a good thing, right? He's promoting it. Apparently he's never read the Bible, or doesn't understand that when the Bible says that these people are reigning over you, it's not a good thing. Dollinger, who's another famous historian of that time, said, "It is the office of the papacy," this is an endorsement really of his, "to tread underfoot kings and emperors." And so it was perfectly all right with these people that the Pope and that the religious ecclesiastical authorities of their day were in charge of these kings and these emperors. That they thought that was a good thing. Now, of course, kings can be abusive too, but to suggest that the great false church should be in charge of them is going a little bit far, don't you think? So let's go on here, because really the control of the great false church was a lot more forceful than people understand. Pope Alexander, who was the Pope during Frederick's reign as the Holy Roman Emperor of Germany, which was before the Habsburg dynasty, was actually defeated by the Pope's army. Now, I'm sure you don't think of the Pope that way, right? The Pope had an army. I mean, if you didn't do what the Pope said, and actually they have soldiers today, if you look at Vatican City, they're kind of symbolic, I think, but they have them. And this day, they had armies. And this Pope had sent his army against this Roman emperor at the time, who was really crowned by the popes in the first place. to teach him a lesson because he wasn't doing what they wanted him to do. And so reigneth over the kings of the earth was literal and meant that if you didn't do it, we'll make you do it. In this Frederick, who was the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, had to beg forgiveness and absolution from the Pope, of course, for his errors. And I don't remember exactly what he did to make this Pope mad, but historians writing about this occurrence wrote, and this was a Catholic historian, who enthusiastically described what happened to Frederick at the hands of Pope Alexander. He said, when the emperor arrived in the presence of the Pope, he laid aside his imperial mantle and knelt on both knees. Right? With his breast on the earth, Alexander advanced and placed his foot on his neck. This is how much power they had. While the cardinals thundered forth in loud tones, thou shalt tread upon the cockatrice and crush the lion and the dragon. These are the cardinals, the guys in the red hats and the robes, right? The next day, Frederick Barbarossa kissed the feet of Alexander. That's the Pope. Frederick was the Roman emperor. And on foot led his horse by the bridle as he returned from solemn mass to the pontifical palace. This historian writes, the papacy had now risen to a height of grandeur and power which had never reached before. The sword of Peter, which is a non-existent sword, had conquered the sword of Caesar. There's no doubt about it. And so when you read in the book of Revelation that this great false church is reigning over the kings of the earth, it's not kidding. It means it literally. And as we're going to see today, they do it in a little bit different way. Now, during the Middle Ages, the interference in the affairs of England and Ireland became obvious in the pages of history, which is what Henry eventually had to deal with in his time. And if you read books like The Norman Conquest, you'll read about William the Conqueror. The Pope had decreed in his day that William, who was the Duke of Normandy at the time, was the lawful claimant to the English crown. And at the time, there was somebody else on the English throne who had inherited it from his fathers. And remember, these people are sitting on the throne of David. And with the Pope's blessing, William the Conqueror killed Harold, who was the King of England at the time, in battle and took England, and was crowned in London on Christmas Day, no less, 1066. And so the Pope was deciding at that time who's going to be the King of England. It wasn't up to them, it was up to him. And William had accepted the crown in a big ceremony in the name of what they called the Holy See of Rome. And this was common practice at that time. And so England was right in the crosshairs of this great false church and her interference and meddling in the affairs of kings. Now, as long as England remained Catholic, Ireland kind of stayed out of the fray. But when England started to become Protestant, that was causing Ireland, which is almost all Catholic, as it is today, a lot of grief. And Pope Adrian gave the crown of Ireland to the King of England, this William the Conqueror. But then later, when England started to become Protestant, this was causing Ireland great grief, as it was Henry, because some of the population wanted to go one way and some of the other. And this interference and this meddling by this great false church, you can see the consequences of that in even our time in the form of the IRA and things like that, because they rose up basically to oppose, unity with Great Britain because of religion, if you get right down to it. Now, Thompson, who's another historian of that time, wrote this: "It would be impossible," he said, "to enumerate the outrages and enormities practiced in England during this gloomy period by kings and popes who considered the assertion of any singular popular right as a crime which God had appointed them to punish." And so they considered themselves your magistrative authority. More than 100 murders, according to this historian, were committed by ecclesiastics during the reign of Henry II, who preceded Henry VIII, in which the parties were not even punished. And so they're killing people and martyring people and burning them at the stake and all of that stuff, and nobody's doing anything about it. The clergy had absolute power over their own body, and no appeal was allowed from their decisions. A layman forfeited his life by the crime of murder, but an ecclesiastic went unpunished. This was called one of the immunities of the clergy, they called it. When the king tried to change the law, so if Henry or one of the other kings decided to challenge all this, the Pope refused his sanction and denounced it as prejudicial to the church and destructive of her privileges. So this is the kind of stuff Henry's dealing with when he decides to break with Rome. Not a world like ours at all, not political, but one ruled and dominated by the great false church in the 17th chapter of the book of Revelation. Now, I could read you other things here, but for lack of time, I'm going to move on. As I said, Elizabeth eventually came to the throne in England, and by that time, they had broken entirely with the Pope. But Elizabeth died without an heir. She never married. And so the crown that is the throne of David, right, that they sat on, passed at that time from the Tudor family, which was the line of kings that Henry had been a part of, to the Stuart family. And so, because there was no male heir, or no heir at all in Elizabeth, the throne changed hands at that time. And this other family, and so they had rules of succession whenever they didn't have heirs to take over, and this was all part of the same royal family, but it wasn't the same line as Henry's. And they reverted right back to all of the practices of the prior kings, forming these alliances with these royal families and causing the people of England a lot of grief, which ended up with Oliver Cromwell, which is not the same Cromwell of King Henry's day, but Oliver Cromwell, who led the English Civil War and left King Charles's head on the steps of London because they had again intermarried with all of these Catholic peoples. He had married a Catholic queen from Spain, and were causing the English people all kinds of grief. And Cromwell and all of them had had it, and they rose up, started a civil war against the government, defeated him, left his head on the steps of the Palace of London, and formed Parliament, which became as inept as the U.S. Congress, which left Cromwell in charge of the country as what was called the Lord Protector. And if you go to Cromwell's grave, where he's buried there in England, there's a plaque that says, "Christ, not man, is king." And so the very idea of the divine right of kings to rule was under siege at that time. And Cromwell and those of his day were the first one to really challenge that. Now, this led to a lot of people fleeing to America, which is how this place came about. And do you know what the rallying cry of the American Revolution was? No king but Jesus. The same rallying cry of Cromwell and his people who had defeated the English crown at that time and formed Parliament. Because they understood the abuses that had went on, and especially when it came to religious freedom. And so when you get up every day and you think about the First Amendment, you should get it out and kiss it, because the founders wrote that to make sure the kind of abuses and nonsense that went on where they came from never happened here, and it hasn't. Now fast forward to our time. Because in a lot of ways, the throne that sits in London, England, and that I've been discussing here, the U.S. presidency is an extension of that, because none of us would be where we are today, located here in the United States or the British Isles, if it wasn't for that throne. And I wore this red tie today to remind all of us that it's because of that crimson thread around Zerah's wrist during that breech birth that God healed with his marriage, the line of those kings to Tia Tepe, the Jewish princess, that all of us are here. And so by extension, U.S. presidents are sort of like lesser kings of the British throne. Interestingly, there was a king in ancient Israel named Jehu, who is very much like what we see Trump doing in our day. God had raised up Jehu in his day to destroy the corruption caused by King Ahab and Jezebel. And what we see in Donald Trump today looks very similar in that he looks to be raised up by God to destroy the works of the modern Ahab and Jezebels, and you can put whatever names you want on there, but unless we forget, before Trump took office again, this place was on its way to being Sodom and Gomorrah, and he is systematically, day by day, thoroughly destroying all of that. If you're watching the news, you know that. He's like taking a hammer, and every day he's plowing another rock out of that corruption. And he's determined, and it looks like God's on his side, and there looks to be incredible similarities between him and Jehu. Unfortunately, for all of us, Trump shares Jehu's flaw. Let's go to 2 Kings, where you read about Jehu. Chapter 10 in 2 Kings, verse 30. God was very pleased with what Jehu had done regarding the destruction of the works of Ahab and Jezebel. And notice what this says, beginning in verse 30. I'm in 1 Kings, 2 Kings, chapter 10, verse 30. And the Lord said unto Jehu, because thou hast done well in executing that which is right in mine eyes. He had totally destroyed the works of Ahab and Jezebel. I mean, completely, totally threw Jezebel. Jezebel was thrown off a roof. I mean, by the time Jehu got done, there was no trace of the corruption of Ahab and Jezebel. And so God was very pleased with that and told him so. And has done it to the house of Ahab according to all that was in my heart. God would have done the same thing. Thy children of the fourth generation shall sit on the throne of Israel. So here's a promise to Jehu's children, and this may be prophetic in regard to Trump's children as well. It wouldn't be uncommon. There's been plenty of instances in the United States where presidents' children came to the presidency. And it looks to be a promise that might apply to Trump, because Trump is doing exactly what Jehu did in ancient Israel. He's destroying the spiritual corruption that was created by the modern day Ahabs and Jezebels, and thoroughly doing it, and determined to continue to do it, as you can plainly tell by watching him and listening to him. Then notice verse 31. Because even though God was very pleased with what he was doing, look what he says. But Jehu took no heed to walk in the law of the Lord God of Israel with all his heart. When I was watching that miniseries, I kept waiting for Henry or somebody to turn completely to God. Never happened. It's never happened in the history of Israel. For he departed not from the sins of Jeroboam, which made Israel to sin. And Trump's not going to do that either, okay? Because they're all immersed in this Babylonian mystery religion that's promoted and stamped on our culture through the great false church in the book of Revelation. And there's no way that he or any of those leaders are going to extricate themselves from that, because it would almost mean they would be irrelevant. Okay? Now, I grew up in a world, and you did too, where the Ten Commandments were everywhere. Yeah, I mean, they were everywhere. Okay? The courthouses, the schoolhouses, the White House, the out, everywhere. And today you can't find them. This place has changed that much in regard to God's law. And notice that the problem God had with Jehu is the same one he's got with Trump and the rest of these guys today. They will not turn to his law. They will not completely, totally surrender to him the way they should. And no matter what kind of lip service, and they give plenty of lip service to God and Christ and the Bible and one nation under God, as they call it, it's not good enough. And the difference between them and the founders isn't that the founders were any more converted than they are, because they weren't unconditionally surrendered to God's law either. But they weren't stupid enough to believe that you could maintain public order and morality without it. Now that's a big difference, okay? Because the God consciousness and public morality that existed in the United States and got us to this point was based on that. James Madison, who was the architect of the U.S. Constitution after they ratified that document, said it as plainly as it could be said. We have staked the whole future, he said, of American civilization not on the power of government, but upon the capacity of each and every one of us to govern ourselves according, this thing's going on, to the Ten Commandments of God. That's not what our leaders would say today, is it? Not at all. Because they're not committed to that, which is why they've been ripped out of all the public buildings, which is why you don't see them anywhere. The founders knew to maintain public morality, you had to have the teachings of Christ, the Bible, and the Ten Commandments, or you would not be successful. They weren't in the Church of God or converted or unconditionally surrendered to that law any more than the people today. But they were not foolish enough to believe that you could succeed without it, which is probably why we're seeing this. Because half measures when it comes to God's law are not good enough. Now, a lot of our leaders, like a lot of those people then, consider themselves Christian and give God and Christ a lot of lip service. But you know and I know that that's not good enough, is it? And one of the reasons we live in perilous times and are having all the difficulty is because people don't understand that. Go to 1 John chapter 3. These are verses of the Bible that I'm sure you're very familiar with. But when people say they're Christian and they have a form of godliness and they reject God's law, they really have revealed that they're not of God at all. 1 John chapter 3 and verse 4, which is one of the first things I mentioned about God's law, or verses 1 through 4. Behold, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us. This is the love of God, that we should be called the sons of God. Therefore the world knoweth us not, because it knew him not. Does the world know who you are? No. Do they care? Not at all. But you are the children of God. Beloved, now are we the sons of God, and it doth not yet appear what we shall be. But we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. And every man that hath this hope in him purifieth himself, even as he is pure. How does he do that? Whosoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law. For sin is the transgression of the law. And so people who claim to be Christian and who aren't repentant of breaking God's law are still filled with sin. And you can't have a Savior if He's not saving you from sin, can you? Go to 1 John chapter 5, where I think it makes it even a little more plain in verses 1 through 3. Whosoever believeth that Jesus is the Christ is born of God. And everyone that loveth him that begotteth, loveth him also that is begotten of him. By this, here it is, flat out, for all these people who give God lip service every day. By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and do what? Keep His commandments. Would you think that I loved God or loved you if I was somebody who flouted God's law? You shouldn't, because it isn't true. For this is, it says, flat out, the love of God, that we keep His commandments, and His commandments are not grievous. All of these ideas that men have and all these attempts they make to correct their problems, apart from God's law, will fail. They're destined to fail. You cannot succeed, and it can't be half measures. The founders got us a long way with half measures. It worked for a while, but I believe the reason we're seeing the chaos we're seeing now is because half measures are never good enough, not with God. And so we have a lot of problems that can only be solved one way. Now, the Great False Church that I talked about, that dominated kings and still dominates people to this day, is still teaching everybody, like it was then, that the law is done away. Now, I'm not going to turn to Matthew, but you know what it says there. Think not that I come to destroy the law, but they teach everybody that the law is done away, don't they? And they tell everybody that you have an immortal soul. So why would they need to keep the law, right? I mean, it's really not about their salvation, right? Now, you can easily prove with your Bible that that isn't so. So I want to read you something else that a Catholic historian wrote about our time, because when you think about the domination of kings anciently, which was so obvious, it can become easy to believe that that's not still going on. But as this historian notes, it actually is going on in a different way now, and just as forcefully. This guy, who writes for the Vatican, concluded his writings this way: the Vatican is the paramount superpower of our times. Did you hear that? The paramount superpower of our times. The United States thinks it's the only superpower right now, and a lot of these other nations with a vast arsenal think they're superpowers, right? Listen to what he says. The Vatican is the paramount superpower of our times. Its adherents, nearly 1 billion, and today it's more than that, can be made to operate in every corner of the world. Did you hear that? Can be made to operate. It's almost like those bots communicating with each other. You know, they have a lot of organizations that are Catholic that have been militant and can be militant and have a lot of different names like Jesuits and others. Hence the importance for every government, he says, this is a guy speaking for the Vatican, of having the Pope as a partner in the pursuance of any given world policy. In other words, we'll interfere, we'll get involved, we'll stop you. It'll turn out the way we want it to go, not the way you do. Vatican policies are directed by the Pope, who has neither Parliament, Congress, or a Senate, or any similar democratic body limiting his decisions, powers, or policies. He is an absolute autocratic ruler in the fullest meaning of that word. They don't hide who they are. They don't pretend to be anything other than what they were. And the reason you see kings and presidents parading Jerome all the time and kneeling down and kissing their ring is because they understand what I just read to you. King Henry was dealing with a power that only God could deal with. He sat on the throne of David, and God helped him to a large extent to escape the power of the Pope. But not completely, right? Just like not completely today do our people turn to God's law, or not at our founding either. And there's only one way with God. It's all the way or no way. There is no middle ground. You can't be submitted to God's law and not be submitted to God's law. So I encourage all of you, we're running out of time, to continue to keep God's commandments as we wait for the real king, whose right it is to inherit that throne that Henry sat on, the throne of David, to rule all nations.